Rain fell over a small country cemetery, the kind of rain that soaks through wool coats and turns fresh dirt into paste. Emily Carter stood at the edge of the open grave, gripping the sleeve of her father's old work jacket like it was the only solid thing left in the world. People whispered around her the way people always do at funerals, as if grief needs a lower volume to be respectful. "Poor girl," one neighbor murmured, glancing toward the farmhouse in the distance. "She have to sell. She's only 16, another answered, shaking her head. Nobody noticed that Emily wasn't looking at the casket. She was staring past it, toward the old barn on the hill, remembering something that had happened only 2 nights before her father died. He had climbed into the barn attic that night carrying a rusty seed tin she hadn't seen in years. When he came back down, the tin was empty. He didn't explain. He just set his weathered hand on her shoulder, smiled in that quiet way of his, and said something she didn't understand at the time. Some things shouldn't grow until people are ready. She hadn't asked what he meant. There hadn't been time. 3 weeks later, sorting through his belongings in that same attic, she found the tin again, tucked beneath a loose rafter board. This time it wasn't empty. Dozens of small cloth bags filled the inside, each one tied off with twine, each one holding seeds she didn't recognize. On top sat a single folded note in her father's handwriting. "If the land forgets, remind it." 6 words. No explanation. Just a door left open, and behind it, a farm nobody expected her to save. The Carter farm had been struggling for years before her father died, and everybody in the county knew it. Crop prices had stayed low while everything else, seed, fuel, equipment, had climbed steadily higher. 2 bad harvests in a row hadn't helped. He'd carried the weight of it alone, the way he carried most things, without ever letting Emily see how heavy it had gotten. Now the whole county seemed to have already decided what would happen next. Sell the land. Pay off the debt. Let a teenager go live somewhere that made more sense. Her Aunt Margaret said it gently, but she said it more than once. "You have your whole life ahead of you, sweetheart. Nobody would blame you for walking away from this." Mr. Jenkins, the old farmer who worked the land next door, had a different way of putting things. He'd leaned on his fence post a week after the funeral and squinted out at the Carter fields. "That soil out there could grow rocks better than wheat," he said. "Don't know why your daddy kept fighting it long as he did." He meant it as a joke mostly. Mr. Jenkins joked about everything, usually right before saying something surprisingly kind. Emily's best friend, Dana, was no help at all when it came to farming, and she'd be the first to admit it. She grew up 2 streets from the county courthouse and thought a silo was just a tall, boring building until she was 14. But she showed up anyway, every day that week, mostly just to sit with Emily and hand her water bottles while she worked. It was Dana who was there when Emily started cleaning out the barn. Underneath old tarps and behind stacked feed bags, Emily found her father's world laid bare. Journals filled with cramped handwriting, hand-drawn planting sketches, rainfall charts going back a decade, maps of the fields marked with symbols she didn't recognize, envelopes of saved seeds, carefully labeled in his neat block letters. Everything pointed to a man who had been quietly researching something for years, something bigger than the yearly rotation of corn and soybeans that kept the farm afloat. But every journal ended the same strange way. Pages had been removed near the back, not torn out carelessly, but cut cleanly with a blade deliberately, like he wanted the record to stop exactly where it did. Emily sat back on her heels in the dusty light of the barn and stared at the mutilated pages. "What were you hiding?" she asked, out loud to no one. Dana picked up one of the journals and flipped through it slowly, careful with the brittle paper. Maybe he was writing a book, she offered. Farmers write books, right? Not ones that cut the last 3 pages out of every notebook they own, Emily said. She spent the rest of that afternoon cross-referencing dates. Her father's rainfall charts went back further than she'd realized, well past her own childhood, into years she only knew from old photographs. Some of the handwriting in the earliest pages wasn't even his. It belonged to someone else, rounder and more deliberate, clearly written by an older hand. When she finally placed it, her stomach dropped. It matched a birthday card tucked away in a drawer upstairs, one signed by her grandfather the year before he passed, long before Emily was old enough to remember him clearly. That meant whatever her father had been working on hadn't started with him. It had started a generation earlier, and somehow it had been quietly passed down, notebook by notebook, without anyone in the family ever speaking of it out loud. At first, she assumed it had to be about money. Maybe her father had found something valuable, some rare crop worth a fortune, and he'd been keeping it secret to protect it, or to sell it later, or to surprise her with it someday. That theory lasted about a week, because the deeper she looked, the less it made sense. If her father had found something worth money, why would he go to such trouble to erase the evidence of where it came from? The real mystery wasn't what the seeds were. The real mystery was why he had hidden them from everyone, including her. Emily didn't plant anything right away. She wasn't reckless enough to put unidentified seeds in the ground without knowing what she was dealing with, so she started asking questions instead. She drove out to see retired farmers who'd known her father for decades. She spent afternoons at the county library, flipping through old agricultural bulletins. She visited the county agriculture extension office and left with more questions than answers. She even tracked down an elderly botanist 2 towns over, a woman named Dr. Halloway who'd spent her career cataloging regional crop varieties. Everyone had a theory. Someone guessed ancient beans. Someone else insisted they were wild peas. One old farmer swore they looked like a barley variety his grandfather used to grow. Nobody agreed on anything. Dr. Halloway was different. When Emily poured a handful of the seeds onto her desk, the older woman went quiet in a way that made the room feel smaller. She turned them over one by one under a magnifying lens, her expression sliding from curiosity into something closer to alarm. "Where did your father get these?" she finally asked. Emily explained what little she knew. The attic, the tin, the note. Dr. Halloway didn't answer right away. She set down the lens, folded her hands, and looked at Emily with an intensity that made the girl sit up straighter. "If these are what I think they are," she said slowly, "you need to be very careful who you tell about this." She wouldn't say more than that, no matter how Emily pressed. She did, however, ask to keep 3 of the seeds for testing, promising to send the results directly to Emily and no one else. Emily agreed, mostly because refusing felt pointless against someone so clearly used to being obeyed. Over the following weeks, piecing together fragments from Dr. Halloway, from other growers, and from long nights reading everything she could find, Emily started to understand the shape of the world her father had stepped into. It was bigger and quieter than she'd expected. A whole network of people who cared deeply about crops most of the country had forgotten even existed, trading knowledge the way other people trade recipes, carefully and without much fanfare. She learned about heirloom seeds, varieties passed down through generations, of families instead of produced fresh, each year by a company. She learned about seed banks, vaults built to protect crop diversity in case disaster wiped out the varieties growing in fields. She learned that thousands of once common crop varieties had vanished over the past century, replaced by a handful of high-yield types bred for uniformity rather than resilience. And she learned that families used to save their own seed every single harvest, a quiet tradition that had mostly disappeared along with the crops themselves. None of it explained why her father had hidden his seeds like a secret worth guarding, but it told her the stakes were higher than she'd assumed. Everyone kept warning her someone might try to steal the seeds. She braced herself for that. She checked the barn locks twice a night for a while, half expecting strangers to show up looking for them. Nobody came. That wasn't the danger at all. She just didn't know it yet. Eventually, Emily stopped waiting for answers and planted a small test patch behind the barn, no more than a few rows tucked where the neighbors wouldn't see it and laugh. They found out anyway. Word travels fast in a county that size, and for a while it seemed like half the town had an opinion about Emily Carter planting mystery seeds in her dead father's field. Nothing came up for 2 weeks. Then 3. Emily started to believe the doubters were right, that she'd wasted good soil and good time on seeds too old to still be viable. Then, on a gray morning in the 4th week, tiny shoots broke through the dirt. The leaves didn't look like anything growing on the neighboring farms, unfamiliar in shape and color, almost stubborn in the way they pushed upward. Mr. Jenkins wandered over to look, hooked his thumbs in his overalls, and studied the little seedlings for a long moment. "Congratulations," he said. "You've invented expensive weeds." Emily laughed despite herself. It was the first time she'd laughed since the funeral. The plants kept growing, and they didn't just survive. They thrived in conditions that should have wrecked them. A late frost hit that would have killed most tender seedlings. These barely slowed down. A stretch of drought followed by punishing rain came next, the kind of swing that usually devastates a young crop. The mystery plants pushed through both. Even the local insects seemed to leave them mostly alone, as though something about the leaves or the stalks simply didn't appeal to them. Emily started keeping a notebook of her own that season, tracking everything the way her father had. Height and leaf color, and how the plants responded after each storm. It felt strange at first, sitting at the same kitchen table where he used to record his own observations, but after a while it started to feel like the most natural thing in the world. Word spread faster than the crop did. Agricultural researchers started showing up to look at the field. A photographer from the regional paper drove out to take pictures. Someone posted the photos online, and within days the plants had a nickname, circulating across gardening, forums, and social media. The ghost crop, something that shouldn't exist, growing where nobody expected it. Then came the offers. Emily assumed, like everyone around her assumed, that people wanted the crop because it could make her rich. A resilient variety like this, one that could survive weather extremes wrecking other farms, would be worth a fortune to the right buyer. She was about to find out that wasn't the reason at all. A representative from a large seed company drove out to the farm on a Tuesday afternoon in a car far too clean for the gravel driveway. He made his offer sitting at Emily's own kitchen table, sliding a folder across the wood like it was a gift. The number inside made Emily's breath catch. It was enough to erase every debt her father had left behind. Enough to guarantee the farm would never be at risk again. Enough that even Aunt Margaret, sitting beside her, squeezed her hand and quietly said, "Emily, you should take this." She almost did. She sat there, staring at the number for a long time, thinking about how much simpler everything would become. How much her father had struggled just to keep the lights on. That night, unable to sleep, she climbed back up to the attic and pulled out the rusty tin one more time, running her thumb along the dented edge the way she used to do as a little girl. That was when she noticed it, a seam along the bottom she'd never paid attention to before. a hidden compartment pressed flat beneath the main tray of seeds. Inside was a single sealed envelope. Her father's handwriting again, but older, like it had been written and stored away long before he died. The letter explained everything. He hadn't discovered the crop himself. Her grandfather had, decades earlier, working these same fields. Researchers had wanted it back then. So had private collectors and buyers with deep pockets. Not because it produced record harvests, her father wrote, but because it thrived under brutal conditions while staying open-pollinated, meaning any farming family could save its seed year after year without needing to buy new stock. Her grandfather understood what that meant. If the crop fell into the hands of a company or a wealthy collector, ordinary farmers would eventually lose access to it entirely, forced to buy new seed every year instead of saving their own the way families had done for generations. So instead of protecting the seeds by hiding them behind locks, he protected them by making the whole world believe the crop had died out. Even his own family believed the story. Her father hadn't learned the truth until much later in his own life, and once he did, he understood the responsibility that came with it. Not to sell, not to reveal, to wait quietly for someone ready to carry it forward the right way. Near the bottom of the letter, in handwriting slightly shakier than the rest, he'd written one more line. I didn't know if that person would be me. I hoped it might someday be you. Emily read the letter twice, sitting on the attic floor with a tin in her lap, the rain starting up again outside, just like it had the day of the funeral. Her father hadn't been hiding a treasure from her. He'd been protecting a promise, one that stretched back further than she'd ever imagined, and he'd chosen her to carry it next. Every family has stories that almost disappeared. Sometimes they're hidden in an old photograph, a handwritten recipe, a weathered toolbox, or even a forgotten seed tin in a dusty attic. If stories about ordinary people preserving extraordinary legacies inspire you, this is the perfect place to be. Subscribe and join us, because there are countless forgotten farms, remarkable families, and incredible true-to-life journeys still waiting to be uncovered. Now let's see what Emily chooses to do with the promise her father left behind. Turning down the seed company's offer didn't end the pressure. It multiplied it. Once word got out that the ghost crop wasn't for sale, everyone still wanted a piece of it. Universities wrote asking for samples. Private collectors sent letters offering even more money than the first company had. Museums inquired about displaying the seeds as historical artifacts. Garden clubs wanted cuttings. Influencers wanted interviews. A handful of investors floated the idea of licensing the variety commercially, promising Emily she'd keep a share of the profits. Even some of the neighbors who'd laughed at her planting mystery seeds a few months earlier were suddenly stopping by with friendly waves and casual questions about how the crop was doing. Mr. Jenkins noticed it too, and he wasn't shy about pointing it out. Funny how success improved people's memory, he said one afternoon, watching a car full of curious strangers pull out of the driveway. Emily didn't know what to do with all the attention. She wasn't against sharing the crop, not after learning what her grandfather had sacrificed to protect it. But she also understood now exactly what could happen if she handed it to the wrong hands. The whole point had been keeping it out of anyone's exclusive control. She spent long nights at the kitchen table, with her father's letter spread out in front of her, trying to figure out what he would have wanted. Should she sell it and finally be free of the farm's debt? Protect it and risk losing it at time the way it had almost been lost before? Or find some way to share it that honored what her grandfather had started? One night Aunt Margaret sat with her at the table, no longer pushing the sale the way she had months earlier. She'd read the letter herself by then, and something in it had changed her mind. "I still worry about the money," her aunt admitted. "But your grandfather didn't build this to be sold to the highest bidder, and neither did your father. I think you already know that." Emily nodded, though she wasn't sure yet what knowing that meant she should actually do. She reached out to Dr. Holloway again, and this time the botanist was far more willing to talk. Through her, Emily learned about community seed libraries, places where local growers could borrow and return seed varieties, the way people borrow books, keeping genetic diversity alive across an entire region instead of locked in one collection. She learned why resilient heirloom crops were becoming more valuable as weather patterns grew less predictable across farming regions. She heard through conversations with growers in different states and even a few in Canada and the United Kingdom how small communities were reviving old crop varieties to strengthen local food systems rather than relying entirely on a handful of mass-produced staples. None of it came from a lecture. It came from real people sitting at real kitchen tables, telling her what they'd learned the hard way. And slowly, the answer to her father's question started to take shape. Harvest came in early autumn, and the crop exceeded everything Emily had hoped for. It wasn't magic. It was resilience, plain and simple, the kind bred into a plant over generations of surviving conditions that would have wiped out something more delicate. But the harvest wasn't really the climax of the story. What Emily did with it was, she turned down the exclusive buyout, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice when she said it. Instead, she partnered with Dr. Holloway and a handful of trusted researchers and local growers, working with a regional seed-saving organization to multiply the crop across several small farms, rather than concentrating it in one place. No single buyer would ever be able to control it again. It would live the way her grandfather intended, spread out, shared, freely available to any farming family willing to grow it. At the county agricultural fair that fall, in the same building where people had once whispered about her selling the farm, Emily set up a small display. She laid out samples of the crop beside her father's journals, the rusty tin, and the letter that had explained everything. She told the whole story, start to finish, to anyone who stopped to listen, and by mid-afternoon a small crowd had gathered around the table, more people than had ever paid attention to the Carter family at a county fair before. She hadn't expected what happened next. One by one, older farmers from around the county began stepping forward, carrying their own tins, envelopes, and jars, seeds their own families had quietly saved for decades without ever making a fuss about it. An elderly woman produced a coffee can full of dried beans her mother had grown every summer since before the war. A man Emily barely recognized handed her a mason jar of corn kernels striped in colors she'd never seen in any field, saying only that his grandfather had sworn him to keep growing a row of it every year, no matter what. Varieties Emily had never heard of. Stories nobody outside those families had ever told, not because they were secrets exactly, but because nobody had ever asked. She hadn't just revived one forgotten crop. She'd reminded an entire community that it still had a history worth protecting. Mr. Jenkins stood near the back of the crowd that day, hat in his hands, watching the whole scene unfold. When Emily caught his eye, he gave her a small nod and a smile that had nothing sarcastic in it for once. "Looks like that rocky soil grew something worth more than money after all," he said. Months later, the Carter farm looked nothing like the struggling operation everyone had written off at the funeral. School groups came out on field trips to learn about seed, saving straight from the rows where it happened. Young farmers showed up with questions. Older farmers lingered afterward, swapping stories about crops their own parents and Grandparents had grown and nearly lost. One evening after the visitors had gone home, Emily climbed back up into the barn attic, the same steps her father had climbed the night before he died. She sat with the old rusty tin in her lap, added a handful of fresh seed from this year's harvest, and tucked her own note beneath his. If the world forgets again, begin here. She closed the lid gently and set the tin back on its rafter, right where it belonged. Outside, the wind moved through the field, carrying the smell of turned earth and ripening grain across the yard where her father used to stand. A legacy like this was never really something you inherited and kept for yourself. It was something you cared for, protected, and eventually, when the time came, passed on to whoever was ready to carry it next.